Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, your favorite midnight quilter, and in this video, I'm finishing up a two-part episode all about Dresden plate quilt blocks. In the previous episode, I showed you how to make a Dresden plate block, as well as 3 different variations. I mean, to be honest, it was almost like an infomercial, but wait, there's more. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to make those blocks shine with a braid layout. Plus, I'm going to give you some tips on machine quilting a sampler quilt. So, let's get to it. For this quilt, I'm using fabrics from my new fabric collection called Inked Rainbow. I'm going to be using these beautiful prints to make the braid blocks. And then I have this crisp white background that's going to really make them shine, and I'll set it off with some cornerstones with this gray fabric. Now what's awesome about this quilt is that it looks so complex, but it's really easy how it goes together. There's no Y seams, there's no partial seams, just straight seams, and a lot of creative trimming to help even out any sewing mistakes. So let's get to cutting out our fabrics. I'm going to start by cutting up the background fabric. I'm going to cut some bigger strips and then some smaller strips. The thinner strips will act as the sashing in between the long columns of my quilt, and the bigger strips will be cut into smaller strips and triangles. And these larger squares will be cut in half diagonally twice to make some setting triangles. And now that the background's all cut out, it's time to start cutting out the other prints. I'm going to need plenty of strips for this quilt. Some of these are for the braid blocks and the rest are for the borders. And now that I have strips and strips and strips and strips cut out, I'm going to cut some cornerstones out of my coordinating solid, and then I'll be ready to put together my first block. All right. My rotary blade is worn out. Let's start making the first part of the block. This first quilt block is going to start with a square in the center and then putting a smaller strip on the top and bottom and longer strips on the side. When I'm done, I have a block that looks like this. I'm going to go ahead and press it before I move on so it's nice and flat, and then square it up. Now I'm going to repeat those steps again, laying out some shorter strips on the top and some bigger strips on the sides. See how cute is that? So I'm going to sew, 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 and then press. And there is that pretty block. So when I designed this fabric, I wrote out a bunch of funny little snarky sayings, like I'd rather be quilting, cut, sew, press, repeat, when in doubt, build a quilt. But I was trying to think of all the funny things that I really, really wanted to put in the fabric, but I didn't have the guts to do it. Like, this quilt took forever, or don't call me a blanket, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe that'll be for the next fabric collection. Oh. So there is my finished block. It's so pretty and so easy. All that's left to do is to chop it in half. I know it sounds scary, that's what the piecing potion is for. But what I'm going to do is cut it in half diagonally once from corner to corner. And there we go. I now have 2 big old triangles. And what we're going to do next is sew them back together. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. No, what I am going to do is make some more of those. But before we see exactly how these work on the quilt, we have to make our braid block. And we're going to start with our Dresden plate block that we made in the previous episode. I'm going to grab my strips of background fabric and I'm going to sew it to the top and the sides. Now here's the thing I want you to notice. It's actually bigger than the block itself. That's going to allow us some wiggle room to trim it to the right size. So even if your piecing isn't perfect, it's going to be fine because we'll trim it and we'll make it look perfect. But I didn't forget about the cornerstone. That's going to go there and fill it up. I'm going to piece this together. Just like that. Now I'm going to piece the cornerstone to the strip and then piece that to the side of the block. And there's the first part of my braid block. Now one of the downsides of this block is that there's a lot of pressing in between. So I'm going to press this before I do the next row. I mean, not that pressing is a downside, it's just that I'm usually excited to get to the block and I don't want to take my time to do this. But it's important, I know, sometimes I gotta be an adult, whatever. That was so nice, let's do it twice, or 4 more times. I'm gonna lay out my strips of my prints, and then my cornerstone. I mean, look how bright and happy that is. It's almost impossible to be sad when you're quilting. I mean, this block is gonna be big, like real big. But it's good because that means I can make this quilt nice and fast. And this is where we start to see that braid effect come out, like they're kind of woven into each other. But I'm basically gonna do the same thing I've already done. I'm gonna sew on the top, then the side, then press. Top and side and press. So I better get to it. The only point I'm worrying about trying to make match would be where the two cornerstones come together. So I'm just gonna kind of make sure that that matches up, and then it doesn't matter how far this extends because I'm gonna end up trimming it off later. 2 down, 3 more to go. One last little touch-up press to make sure it's nice and flat. And I have the first part of my block done. I've got to turn this around and do the same on the other side. And it's going to be the same exact thing. I'm going to use the same strips. I'm going to align it with one corner and let it extend past the other. And then I'll put my cornerstone and sew it on. All right, I'm going to do the same thing, adding another strip on both sides and my cornerstone, but the good news is this is where it ends. On this side, I'm only adding 2 strips. So once I'm done with this, the block is almost finished. And there I have my block. Now it's time to trim off all these ragged edges and make it into a block. But the surest path to sadness is to just start hacking in on this thing. So I'm gonna take my time with this step. First, I'm gonna make sure that it's straight to my mat. So I'm gonna take a second and make sure that the top and bottom point are lining up on that same point. And we know that quilters love our notions, and I just happen to have my handy laser light right here. Aligning it along the edge is gonna help me ensure that it's nice and straight to the mat. All right, so now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna measure and mark a little reference line. I wanna make sure that I have 1/4 inch between the corner of my Dresden block and the edge of my block. So I'm gonna lay the ruler across and make sure that the block is centered, and I'm gonna mark out that 17.5 measurement. Yep, and I'll do the same on the top and the bottoms. So now I have 3 reference lines that I can line up with my ruler. And then I'm gonna carefully, oh so carefully, place my ruler, line up all 3 of those reference dots, and trim the edge. I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Now that I have the edges trimmed up, we're gonna take the pointy top of our block and make it look more like a regular quilt. So using those large triangles of background fabric, I'm gonna fold them in half, and I'm gonna find the midpoint of the longest side. I could just use the fold line, but I'll give it a quick little mark with my pencil. Then I'm gonna do the same on my block. I just wanna fold it in half, find that midpoint, and then I'm gonna align the midpoints of both of those, pin it in place, and sew them together using that 1/4 inch. And then I'm gonna press it open and repeat on the other side. So the edges don't need trimmed up. I said I was gonna trim them up though, didn't I? So
if they needed it.
If they need it.
Yeah.
Perfect.
If they needed it.
Perfect, then I won't show that. And then taking my longer strip of background fabric, I'm gonna sew it right to the top. Now why does that look too short?
Because it probably does need to be trimmed.
Probably, yeah. Irene's like, sliver trimming! You've got to do it! Don't trust your eyes. That's bizarre, because it looked totally straight, didn't it? This is why you use sliver trim, huh? I guess you should trim. Things make so much more sense now. I mean, look how off it is.
She has seen the light.
Huh. Now it makes sense why none of my stuff is coming out right. So the moral of this story is trim it even if it doesn't look like it needs to be trimmed. See, even I learn new stuff. I always just thought it was my not ironing that made it not work out.
That may be a piece of it.
Turns out it's just the trimming. Once it's trimmed, there's one last piece to add. It's going to be that rectangle on the top that magically fits all of a sudden. Amazing. Now I have the first one, I'm going to repeat to make a second strip, just like this. So now I have my 2 blocks finished, and I'm going to join them together to make a column because rows are just so horizontal. So what I'm going to do is take those triangles I cut out of the squares earlier, and I'm going to line it to the side of the block like this. Place it right sides together, and then sew with that 1/4 inch seam. Then I'm going to press that flat and repeat with the other piece. So I have both of them finished. Here's my next block. It's just the same, but I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to line up these points and then sew the pieces together. After a quick press, this first column is finished. I'm going to repeat this to make some more columns and then I'll show you how the whole quilt comes together. Well, if you loved the first column, you're going to love the second one. The blocks come together the exact same way, except I have more blocks and less sashing. The result is 3 beautiful blocks on point. I have my first 2 columns, and then I have the sashing pieces in between. And what's nice is I don't have to worry about matching up any of these seams. So I'm going to get this sewn together, and then I'll show you what the rest of the quilt looks like. And my quilt top is finished. I made the other 2 rows the same way with different blocks that I made in that prior episode. And you can check that out if you want to watch how they're put together. I love how these braids really frame the Dresden blocks and help them shine. Well, now it's time to do the funnest part, the machine quilting. So I'm going to get this ready and I'll see you there. All right, I'm switching things up and I'm actually going to quilt my quilt on the Handy Quilter Capri. And I'm also going to go wild and crazy with the thread color. I know, it's just a crazy time. I put together these coordinating threads for the Dresden plate quilt. So I used the gray to go around those Dresden blocks. Loved how it set it off, but for the quilting, I'm going to use lime green. I know, it sounds scary, but I think it's going to look beautiful. This green color is one of my favorites in the quilt, so I know it's really going to pull it out. And even though you look at the spool and you might think, wow, that's really dark, you got to really see what it looks like with just the thread on there. I think it's going to look great. We'll see how it turns out. A few things that I like to do when I'm machine quilting a sampler quilt like this is to pick designs that can be used in a variety of spaces and shapes. So using designs like continuous curve and wishbones and designs that can fit all those different areas are going to make it a lot easier. Plus, all the 2-inch strips on here are the perfect size for sashing designs. Well, I'm going to switch it up and do a lot of different stuff, so let's get to it. So let's start in a Dresden block. I'm going to do a little bit of stitching in the ditch to really show off the pieced elements of the blade. And because I think it's so cute and whimsical, I'm going to add a little loop in between. Now, of course, stitching in the ditch is something that I do because I love how it looks, but it's not necessary. It's definitely up to you. Now, let's have some fun in those sashing strips. One of my favorite designs to use in 2-inch strips is a serpentine line. I love how it gives the block a curvy kind of look, almost rounded, and I like how you can use it to turn the corner. It might look a little tricky, but it's really just the same shape over and over again. I'm quilting a line that curves out from the edge towards the other side, but as it approaches the other seam, I'm going to make it look like it's merging into the side. That's what's really going to make it look like it's curving in. And then I'm going to echo that shape again and again, just making sure that I fill in the area as much as possible. Now these triangles, I'm going to do another variation of the continuous curve. I'm going to quilt a line that arcs to the midpoint, out and back, out and back, and out and back, until I reach the opposite side. Another design I love to use in sashings is a wishbone design. This design can be used in areas of all sizes, but it works especially well in sashings that are 2 inches wide. To quilt a wishbone, I'm going to quilt a line that angles towards the other side. But as I approach that other seam, I'm going to change direction and head towards the other side. The trick to quilting wishbones is I want to keep those lines parallel to each other. So it doesn't matter how steep or shallow I quilt them, as long as they're parallel, it will progress nicely. So I'm loving how this is looking so far. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little teeny bit nervous about the green thread, but it looks amazing. So I'm gonna finish this up and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. And this quilt is finished. It looks so complex and difficult, but it's really easy in how it goes together. The fabrics just shine and it really sets off the beautiful Dresden plate blocks. And I went a little wild and crazy with the machine quilting thread and I think it paid off. That green thread looks amazing. And one lucky viewer will win the quilt kit, which includes the fabric to make the Dresden plate blocks, the quilt top, and the binding. All you have to do is click a link in the description box below, and I'll announce the winner next week. And I'll be back soon with another episode of the Midnight Quilter. Until then, happy quilting!